Good evening, everybody. Before we start our class tonight, I'd like to mention that we are learning the Zecher Nishmas, the woman who unfortunately passed away, was murdered ruthlessly in cold blood in the Chabad house in Poway, California. And we pray for the healing, the quick healing, quick recovery of all those who were injured, and for the healing of the world, really. World peace, because what happened was just very dark and very evil, and we have to, in our own way, we have to try to bring in more light into our world. So now the question we want to address tonight: how should we handle our own indiscretions? How do we handle our own indiscretions when they happen, and specifically when they were committed inadvertently? When we commit something inadvertently, how do we handle that? How do we look at that? How do we view that? How do we approach that? So tonight's lesson is about identifying our unconscious self. Did you know that you have an unconscious self? We have an unconscious self. There's the self that's conscious, the one that we're aware of, and then there's also the unconscious self. And we're going to talk about how that unconscious self plays a role in those actions that we take that are inadvertent. Because sometimes, you know what they call it? They call it the Freudian slip. Heard that expression before, the Freudian slip? Sometimes we'll do something because that's really where we're at, but we would never allow our conscious self to take us there if we were fully conscious of it. But there's always something that, in our subconscious that takes us there. So this is really what we're going to explore tonight. But we begin with a topic that appears in this week's Seder, this week's Parsha, which is all about Yom Kippur, all about the Day of Atonement. Now, notwithstanding the fact that we have so many lingering politicians and business leaders and entertainers who have committed all kinds of indiscretions, and yet they linger around and they're still prominent, etc., etc. But forgiveness is really quite hard to achieve in the courtroom of public opinion. People are not so quick to forgive. When somebody does something, they may maintain their position, but as far as the way most people approach them, or most people's attitude towards them, without repeating anything that people would say, it's less than generous. So let's begin over here in text number 1, where we learn that in the Torah, in our relationship between us and God, we do have the opportunity to achieve forgiveness. Unlike the court of popular opinion, we do have the opportunity to achieve forgiveness in our relationship with God. So in text number 1, and all this shall be as an eternal statute for you. In the 7th month, on the 10th of the month, you shall afflict yourselves, and you shall not do any work, neither the native nor the stranger who dwells among you. For on this day he shall effect atonement for you to cleanse you. Before God you shall be cleansed from all your sins. This is what the Torah says in this week's Seder. This is essentially the very first ordinance in the Torah that establishes the day of Yom Kippur as a day of atonement. And the Torah tells us what we need to do on the Day of Atonement, but that's all besides the main point that we're trying to make here, which is that we are able to achieve forgiveness between ourselves, between human and God, on Yom Kippur. What's the idea of Yom Kippur? According to many commentaries, this is an expression of God's mercy for us. Because if there was no opportunity to achieve atonement, then over time, we would kind of accumulate all kinds of indiscretions, and the end result wouldn't be a positive one. So God provides us with the opportunity once a year to reclaim and to rejuvenate our relationship with God and to beg for forgiveness. So in text number 2, we read from the Sefer Achinuch, from the Book of Education. It's one of our real popular and favorite ones. He says as follows. It's in text number 2, and should be page 5 in the student book. The message of this mitzvah is this: out of God's kindness towards his creatures, he fixed one day in the year for the atonement of their sins when they return in repentance. If the iniquities of the creatures would accumulate year by year, their measure would be full at the end of 2 or 3 years or more, and the world would be liable for destruction. Thus God, blessed be He, saw in His wisdom, for the survival of the world, to fix 1 day a year for the penitent for the atonement of sins. Now the biblical verse that we cited earlier, in text number 1, it states, I'm just going to read out in the Hebrew in the last line, and then I'll translate it. Ki bayom hazeh, for on this day, yechaber aleichem, He shall effect atonement for you, letaher eschem, to cleanse you, mikoil chatoisechem, from all of your sins. For God, for all of your sins. Now, what does this mean, for all of your sins? What it means is that there are really 2 categories within sin. Within sin itself, you could have multiple sins. You could have a lot of sins. So God is atoning for all of the sins, meaning a lot in measure, a lot in number. And then you could have different categories within sin itself. There is intentional sin, and then there's inadvertent sin, and then there's the sin that was committed completely in error or out of compulsion. In other words, you were forced to. It was what we would refer to as onus. We're going to talk more about this in a moment. But before we go there, let's go to a verse in Tehillim and Psalms. King David says in text number 3, he says, "Who can be aware of errors?" He's speaking to God, and he says, "Who can be aware of errors? Clean me of unperceived guilt. Shkiais miyavin, who can be aware of errors? Ministarais nakeni, clean me of unperceived guilt." Now, I will tell you that this language, this expression here that's used in the Tehillim, in the Psalms here by King David, adorns many, is featured, I should say, in many introductions to many books that are written. Very often, Torah authors will use this verse almost as a license, not as a license to make a mistake, but as kind of absolving themselves of the fact that we're all human, admitting to the fact that we're all human, and we may have made a mistake. We may have a mistake in judgment. We may have a mistake in language or in spelling or whatever it might be. Shkiais miyavin, who can be aware of errors? There are errors that happen. We're only human. But then the verse continues and talks about unperceived guilt, meaning guilt that somehow it's guilt, but it's unperceived. It's not something I'm aware of. Let's talk about this for a minute. When we first talk about shigia, when we first talk about an error, who can be aware of errors? What kind of error are we talking about? So there's an act that will be committed without awareness of the fault that's involved. So I'll give you an example. If somebody knows that, he knows that it's, let's take a step back. He wakes up in the morning, it's time to make breakfast. So he walks over to the stove, he lights the stove, and he goes about making his famous scrambled eggs in the morning. Okay? So a mistake like this could take on the form of a shgia, of an error that we're describing here, in 2 fashions. He may not know, or she may not know, that it's Shabbos, and turning on a fire on Shabbos is prohibited, so it's a creative labor. Or they might not know that it's Shabbos. So in other words, they might not know that it's Shabbos, and they might not know that on Shabbos one is prohibited from doing this action. So in other words, a person did not know that what they're doing is an avera, either because they don't realize it's Shabbos. They just wake up in the morning. They're suffering from a hangover. Yeah, they have no clue what the day is, no clue. Their head is spinning. They don't know how long they slept. They slept 1 bagel, 2 bagels, 3 bagels, whatever it is. They wake up. They have no idea what day it is. But they have to eat something. Absolutely famished, and they go and they make themselves their morning breakfast. So there's one possibility: the person doesn't know what today's Shabbos. One possibility. The other possibility is they don't know that on Shabbos one's not permitted to do this thing. So this is what we refer to as a shgia. A shgia is b'shaygig. This is what we refer to as a shaygig. You can hear this word over and over again tonight. Shaygig is a category of sin which is inadvertent. You didn't realize. But then there's also something called unperceived guilt, which is there's a hidden wrong. There's a hidden wrongdoing. and some reason it requires being cleaned from it. What does King David mean when he asks God, clean me of these wrongdoings that are hidden? Well, what does he mean? And how are they related to the shgia, to the inadvertent action? Because it would seem like the inadvertent action is just that. I really should not bear any responsibility for an inadvertent action because I didn't intend it. So what does this mean that I should be cleansed from any type of wrongdoing that's hidden? Why is that coming on the heels of describing this shigia, this shogeg, this inadvertent action? Now, bringing this a little closer to home, we just finished the holiday of Pesach. And as you may know, that many are very careful when it comes to Pesach, especially when it comes to Pesach. Some people go way overboard. I've seen people do this, they go way overboard, and their house looks like it's a rocket ship because they cover everything with silver foil. Literally everything, including the fans on the, I'm just kidding about the fans in the mud. But really, they cover everything that would ever touch any food. Now, where does this all come from? So first of all, the Talmud and the medieval commentaries, they all tell us about the concept of Chumrah de Pesach, of the additional stringencies that exist within the practice of Pesach. And they tell us how, when it comes to Pesach, it's different than or throughout the year, where anything that is prohibited, also a prohibited substance, so for example, if you were to have a drop of milk that falls into a big pot of soup, so there's always going to be a 60% ratio, 60-time ratio that will neutralize that drop of milk. Okay, so if you have milk and meat, we all know milk and meat, the Torah tells us not to have milk and meat. So if you have a drop of milk, it falls into a pot of soup, you have a 60-time ratio that would neutralize the milk and therefore tell you it would basically pronounce that soup as kosher. Anything less than that would be non-kosher. When it comes to Pesach, there's an element which takes the halachic stringencies to an umpteenth degree. What is that? Even a teeny drop of chametz, meaning of leavened matter, if it mixes with anything else, it causes it to be prohibited on Pesach. So even if you had that one little drop, the 60-time ratio doesn't apply in Pesach. Pesach is much more stringent. The Arizal, the father of contemporary Kabbalah, lived about 500 years ago. He tells us in text number 4, on page number 6, the Arizal wrote that one who is vigilant concerning even a trace of chametz on Pesach is guaranteed not to sin the entire following year. Now, to make such an assertion, you think that's worth it, right? Well, why not?
Say I want that.
You want it in writing? You want it in writing?
Except I've got it.
You got it in writing.
In writing. Still not satisfied.
So somebody who's stringent, even with regard to a trace of chametz on Pesach, is guaranteed not to sin the entire following year. What's this all supposed to mean?
Don't people say that so boldly because it's impossible?
How do you make such a statement when people have to obviously retain their freedom of choice? What does it mean that they're guaranteed not to sin? So we're going to see a little later what this means. The Rebbe, in one of his talks, explained the following. The Arizal doesn't mean that you won't sin the entire year. What he's talking about is a specific category of sin. Not all sin, but a specific category of sin. What category of sin? So he tells us in text number 5, the Arizal wrote that one who was vigilant concerning even a trace of chametz on Passover is guaranteed not to sin the entire following year. Perhaps his intention is that no wrong shall befall him accidentally. Accidentally is the key. For he certainly retains his volition even then, meaning he retains his freedom of choice. So there's no question about this very important fundamental principle of the Torah, where we never abdicate our freedom of choice. Our freedom of choice is our freedom of choice. That's who we are. We are human beings who have freedom, and we can choose. This idea of being careful on Pesach doesn't take away our freedom of choice. What's the idea what is the idea behind the Arizal statement that a person will ultimately not be led to do something accidentally? The accidental sin won't come his way.
sense because he's completely out of his head and into his work. So he won't get misled or sidetracked or like
You're definitely onto something.
dig his own hole. He's out of his head and into his.
Yeah, granted, I will grant you that you're definitely on the heels of the explanation.
He's not making his own routes, basically. He doesn't have time for it, for something.
Okay, so the question we want to ask ourselves is sin, which is inadvertent, are we culpable for that? Are we really culpable for sin, which is inadvertent? We didn't intend it. We woke up in the morning with a hangover, or we slept 3 bagels and we don't know what day it is. We got up and we made ourselves breakfast, and it turns out it was Shabbos. I had no intention of violating the Shabbos, and I lit the fire. I had no intention. I really had no intention. So should I really be guilty of that? Well, when it comes to Yom Kippur, what do we say on Yom Kippur? In text number 6, we talk about, we confess, right? And for the sin which we have committed before you intentionally or unintentionally, for all these, God of pardon, pardon us, forgive us, atone for us. This is the famous Al-Chet. There's this part of the liturgy that we repeat a number of times throughout Yom Kippur, probably like 5-6 times, maybe more than that, maybe 9 times. Lots of times, lots and lots of times. And one of the things we are saying there is Al-Chet shachatonu lifonecha b'zadinu mishkaga, meaning for the sin which we have committed before you intentionally or unintentionally. And the law, in fact, is codified in the Rambam and Maimonides in text number 7. If a person transgresses any of the mitzvahs of the Torah, whether a positive command or a negative command, willingly or inadvertently, when he repents and returns from his sin, he must confess before God, blessed be he. As the verse states, if a man or a woman commits any of the sins of man, they must confess the sin that they committed. Why is this so? Why do we have to confess? Why do we have to ask forgiveness for an inadvertent sin? This seems to be so strange. I did it unintentionally. What's it got to do with me? So here we're going to take a moment to delve into the differences between the category of sin which would be called onus and onus is translated as forced. So if somebody forced us to do something, that would be an onus. And we're going to give that some bones and meat and sinews soon. And then shogeg. Shogeg is unintentional, inadvertent. These are the 2 categories. Onus is forced. Shogeg is inadvertent and unintentional. Anytime the ability has been withdrawn from us to do something different, that would be considered forced. That would be considered onus. If somehow we were inhibited, we were blocked, we were being forced to do something, we don't have the choice, we no longer have the ability to act differently, that is considered an ones, we were being forced. Shogeg is unintentional, inadvertent. So let's say, for example, imagine you're shopping and you come across a delectable looking, I should say, veggie burger, which advertises itself as completely organic and vegan and gluten-free and rainforest-friendly and fair trade certified. It has everything. Perfect. But after a few months, you find out that, you know something, they were actually mixing in just a little bit of horse meat in there. Besides for feeling betrayed, right? You also have eaten something which is not kosher. The question becomes, are you culpable? That would be a good example of an oinus. You were forced to. In other words, there was nothing you could do to avoid that.
There's no hechsher on it either, though.
Let's say you did find it with a hechsher. You found it with an OU, an OK, or a star K, or whatever preferred hechsher you found.
A situation I personally know plenty well. I had a huge kosher enough category. Abounding one. So,
but there were cases.
But if I cared so much about the stupid OU, I wouldn't be eating the veggie burger just...
But let's talk about a case where you did
what do
find
you
one
say?
with an OU, with an OK. I'll give you an example. Not long ago, unfortunately, we had a situation like this
Funny,
in Muncie,
Chicken, yeah.
where there was an individual, for whatever reason, can't explain it, and I'm not sure he can explain it, who was selling non-kosher meat under the guise of kosher meat.
How about the fact that it costs a tenth as much as kosher meat?
I didn't want to explain it. Let's put it that way.
It's different.
Okay, I appreciate the explanation. I'm sure everybody else does, but I'd rather give him the benefit of the doubt, and because I don't know, so I'm going to say that I don't understand. Whatever the case is here, the consumer didn't really have much of a choice because they thought it was kosher. What else are they supposed to do? They need kosher food. Okay. That's what we would refer to as an ones, and the halacha with regard to an ones, to a forced situation, is in text number 8. The merciful one exempts a person who was forced. Ones rachmana patre. And in fact, in terms of conceptualizing the law, Rabbi Yosef Engel, who was a brilliant thinker, in text number 9 tells us, I would suggest that the proper understanding of the notion that the merciful one exempts a person who was forced is this. A deed that a person performs as a consequence of coercion cannot be attributed to him. It is as though the deed happened on its own, and he is not the one who committed the deed. So it's like the deed happened, it just happened. It was meant to happen, so it happened. But as far as its attribution to me, there's no attribution to me. It's not attributed to me. I didn't perform that action.
If it's not time and place for it, just please tell me, and I'll take it off the table. Do the spiritual entities factor in here? It's not kosher for the sake of keeping kosher. We don't know all the algebra that's involved, but kosher food is not necessarily for God, it's for us on some algorithm. Sensitizes our soul better. It's somehow healthy for us on some spiritual plane to eat kosher food. The opposite thereof would imply it's unhealthy to do otherwise. Is the spiritual damage still there?
If we did something?
If we ate, let's say, non-kosher horse, we don't eat. Yes, God said so, but He didn't say so.
I would venture to say yes. I would venture to say yes. I don't think we have any. I don't think we have any text here tonight that addresses that question. But I believe I would venture to say that it does. Yeah, I believe so. And there are a number of stories that come to mind that I think bear out that point. But we'll get to that, God willing, a little bit later. So let's move on to the next category, to the category of shogeg, where we're talking about an unwitting but deliberate action. When we say unwitting but deliberate action, what we're talking about is, take again for the example we talked about it before. You forgot that today is Shabbos, or you forgot that the action is prohibited on Shabbos. One of the two. So the act itself is deliberate. However, you forgot the consequences of the action. So there was no real intent to violate the law. There's no intent to violate the law in that case, because either you forgot today's Shabbos, or you forgot that this action is prohibited on Shabbos. But nonetheless, you definitely deliberately acted. It wasn't like somebody forced you to act. Okay. Another example would be if you acted based on assumptions. Let me just finish this point. You acted based on assumptions. That's a shogeg. A shogeg carries some level of liability higher than an oinus. It's a little higher than being forced. In other words, a little bit more intense. We're going to see soon.
You get in the car after too many. You don't want to hurt anybody, but you put yourself in that situation. Nobody made you.
Okay, so I'm not sure that would be considered even a shogeg. I don't know that would be considered a shogeg. That might actually be karev lemezid, closer to intentional wanton act.
Absolutely didn't want to hurt anybody.
I understand you absolutely did not want to hurt anybody, but it's not like you forgot that it's possible to hurt somebody. You didn't forget that by drinking and driving you might hurt somebody. You didn't want to, granted, but you didn't forget that the driving under the influence, it might possibly knock somebody over and take their life. So it's a little closer to mezid. It's a little closer to a wanton act. But the second example we want to talk about of a shoygig, of an inadvertent but deliberate action, would be something where, we acted on assumptions. We acted on assumptions. So just as an example, somebody invited you over to their house, and I'll tell you a story that happened to me, because that's the best. When I was a student, I was sent out as an emissary with a whole group of young men to Sydney, Australia. We spent a year there, and we did various activities, including studying in the yeshiva and supporting the yeshiva. But we did various activities in the town, in the city, to bring greater awareness of Judaism to our brethren, our Jewish brethren. So there was one time when I was asked by a colleague to go out to another city nearby, where my colleague would, on a weekly basis, he would visit a very lovely couple who were on their way to becoming fully observant, but supposedly kept a kosher home. And they would serve them dinner, and the young traveling rabbis would discuss Hasidic ideas, specifically the Tanya. Okay. So he said to me, come substitute for me, because I can't make it. Go and substitute. So I went with another fellow, and we talked about Tanya, and they gave us dinner, and they gave us dessert. Now, a little later, we started scratching our heads. Wait a second. Tell me, that chocolate that we had for dessert, was that parve? Was that non-dairy? Or was that a dairy type of chocolate?
It's too good.
So the problem was not that you can't have dairy chocolate. The problem is that if you have dairy chocolate after you had a meat dish, that would be a problem. And so as it turned out, that's exactly what it was. We had a dinner it was a delicious dinner, wonderful. We had a wonderful conversation, and then without realizing, they gave us this great chocolate, but the chocolate was dairy chocolate. So whose fault is that? It's my fault. My fault because I didn't do my due diligence. I assumed that they were giving me completely kosher food. So this would be an example of a shogeg. It wasn't amazing. It wasn't a wanton transgression, but I didn't do my due diligence to make sure that what I was eating was in fact 100%. So it does carry some liability. So in text number 10a, we read from Ramban, from Nachmanides. We've talked about Nachmanides in the past. He was in the generation following that of Maimonides, but one of the greatest minds and the greatest authorities of all time in Jewish history. In text number 10a, he has a work all about reward and punishment. It is called Shar Hagmul, the gate of reward. So he says like this, in text number 10a, on student page 10, if a person eats the forbidden fats of a kosher animal, he is called a sinner, a chota, for he is deemed as such throughout the Torah. But what is his sin? He was not mindful of himself and did not sufficiently respect and fear the words of God. A person ought not eat, or do anything without properly checking and discovering this thing to be permissible and appropriate according to the decrees of the Holy One, blessed be He. So if somebody partook of what he refers to over here as a part of the animal which is not kosher, meaning the Torah tells us not to have this part. It's specifically certain areas of the animal we don't eat of. And in fact, the whole back part of the animal, the whole hind of the animal is sold today. In today's day and age, we just take the whole thing and we sell it off to some Gentile processor that will take that and sell it, and they'll eat it. Even though it comes from a slaughtered animal that was slaughtered according to Torah law, but because there are nuances that we are not familiar with today well enough, or most people are not familiar well enough with it, so we just take the whole hind of the animal and we just sell it. So if somebody ate from that part, certain fatty parts of it, their chaylev, certain parts of the animal we're not permitted to eat. So if a person did partake of it, inadvertently, say for example, he had a piece of that on the table and right next to it he had some other piece of meat that looked strikingly similar. And it was very difficult for him to know which one was kosher. He ate one of them, he just doesn't remember. He doesn't know. He wasn't sure which one was chelev and which one was shuman, meaning which one was the forbidden fat and which one was the permissible meat. So the Ramban tells us that a person should have been more careful and therefore bears a certain level of responsibility. But then the Ramban, Nachmanides, continues to explain something a little deeper. He tells us in text number 10b on page 11. Any forbidden thing, and this speaks to your point, Senya, this sullies the soul and defiles it. As it is stated, you will become unclean through them. The Torah actually tells us this, that by eating something that's not kosher, so it does something to our inside. It makes us either more or less sensitive to that which is godly. Thus, the inadvertent violator, the shogeg, is called a sinner. Nevertheless, the shogeg does not need to be punished for his inadvertent transgression in purgatory and in the pit of destruction. I should have given you a disclaimer before that the Nachmanides is going to be using terms that are very common in the works that were written in that age. They refer very heavily to this concept of Gehenna and purgatory, etc. They use this freely. We are not
about circa what year?
1300. Not that we...
Just a lot of Dante time, a lot of brimstone.
That's right. In other words, that was the focus. Not that in today's day and age, traditional orthodoxy has somehow rejected those ideas, but it's just that the focus is much more on the positive rather than fire and brimstone. Exactly. So he says, rather he must be scrubbed of that sin, to be sanctified and purified of it, so that he will be worthy of the place in the world to come that he has earned through his good deeds. So a person has earned a place in the world to come through his good deeds. He wants to make sure that he's able to enjoy that and be able to absorb that reward. And for that purpose, it's necessary for the individual to go through some level or some stage of cleansing. Therefore, the Holy One, blessed be, out of compassion for his people and his pious ones, gave them the ability to atone for their inadvertent transgressions through the sacrificial order. Here he doesn't talk about Yom Kippur, of the Day of Atonement. He talks about the idea of bringing a korban, bringing a sacrifice. Sacrifice helps a person go through this process of internal cleansing.
That was only during the time of the Torah,
That's a great question. Does this only apply earlier? So the answer to that would be, in its original state, yes, obviously. However, the prayers were instituted to be in place of those sacrifices, those offerings. And so when we engage in prayer, and here's a great place to plug our new course. Thank you for signing up. And our new course is going to be called With All My Heart. And in case you find prayer to be monotonous or be meaningless or stale or any of these synonyms, this course is for you. It will provide you with a fresh perspective of what prayer is about and generally spiritual experience, Judaism's perspective on spiritual experience as a whole. So hopefully that responds to your question. Yes, the sacrifice was something we could only offer in the temple, but in today's day and age, we have prayers that take their place. So what do we glean from Nachmanides? That although a person may have performed this action with no malice, however, there is an impact on the person's soul. It does impact the person negatively, and it leaves its mark, for which reason we need to do tshuva, we need to repent, we need to atone for it, etc. I'm going to skip this optional section here. Having said that, the question we need to answer is as follows. In Judaism, punishment is meted out for something we did in the present. It's not meted out for what we should have done to avoid it. It may be meted out for what we did. But the fact is, it's not meted out for all the homework that we didn't do before in order to avoid the sin. The punishment is given for what we did. And not what we're going to do, for what we did. It's in the present. So why do we say that in the case of the inadvertent sin, why are you being charged for it? Because you didn't do your due diligence. What is this all about? What is the deeper concept behind this? There must be something
no
deeper.
Need then for kedurim around kedurim, fences around fences around fences. Then,
If what?
if the one fence is not enough, hey, we shouldn't be punished. There's no need for extra fences then.
There is no need for extra fences.
Then it's very clear. But
So
we still do it.
why are we liable? Why are we liable for something that we failed to do our homework on? We failed to educate ourselves about enough before. Why is that something that we have to atone for? And why does, going back to the verse that King David said, ministaros nakeni, for those things which are hidden, for the concealed wrongdoing, help me cleanse myself. In other words, he's doing tshuva for that which is concealed, meaning it's not something that is in the open. When it comes to an act that's in the open, it makes sense. We're asking God for atonement. But for that which is concealed, meaning it's somewhere deep within my subconscious, why do I have to have God atone for that? As we say in the Al-Chet, we're asking God for atonement for the inadvertent sin. And as the Ramban explained, that it causes, it has an effect, it has a negative effect on our neshama. But at the end of the day, we didn't do it consciously. So why are we asking, and why is it necessary for us to achieve atonement for that? And just in order to sharpen the point, I'd like to cite here the wonderful metaphor from the Talmud regarding which the body or the soul incurs culpability for sin. Which of the two? The body or the soul? So here in text number 12, we have a conversation that takes place between the Roman Emperor Antoninus, who was very friendly in that era. He was very friendly with the Jews, and Rabbi Yehuda Nossi, the redactor of the Mishnah. So we have this conversation that's recorded. Antoninus said to Rabbi, the body and the soul can both free themselves from judgment. Thus the body complete, the soul has sinned, proof being that from the day it left me, I lie like a dumb stone in the grave, powerless to do anything. So once the soul is gone, the body can do nothing. So you see, it's the soul's fault. It's not my fault, says the body. It's not my fault. While the soul can say, the body has sinned, the proof being that from the day I departed from it, I fly about in the air like a bird and commit no sin. So which one is it? This is Antoninus' question to Rabbi Yehuda Nossi. Rabbi Yehuda replied, I will tell you a parable. To what may this be compared? To a human king who owned a beautiful orchard that contained splendid figs. Now he appointed 2 watchmen over it, one lame and the other blind. One day, the lame man said to the blind, I see beautiful figs in the orchard. Come and take me upon your shoulders so that we can reach and eat them. So the lame rode on the blind man, reached and ate them. Some time after, the owner of the orchard came and inquired of them, where are those beautiful figs? The lame man replied, have I then feet to walk with? And the blind man replied, have I then eyes to see with? What did he do? He placed the lame upon the blind and judged them together. So each one thought that he was going to get away with it because on his own he wasn't going to be culpable. So the owner of the orchard took both of them together. Okay, we're going to put you one on top of the other. This is the way you committed the crime, and this is the way you're going to be judged. So too the Holy One, blessed be He, brings the soul, places it in the body, and judges them together, as it is written, He shall call to the heavens from above and to the earth, that He may judge His people. He shall call to the heavens from above, this refers to the soul, and to the earth, that He may judge His people, this refers to the body. So what's the implication? The implication seems to be that only when the body and the soul, in fact, commit the crime together, that's when there's culpability. However, when the soul is absent, meaning if the mind is absent, if you're not thinking about it, if you do it inadvertently, how could you incur culpability? How could you be culpable? How could you be guilty? Your mind wasn't there. It was a mindless act. And so what do we have to ask forgiveness for? There's no place for punishment, and there's no place for forgiveness. There's no place for atonement. Now, to explain the next section, I need to give a little bit of an introduction, part of which you probably have heard from me before. And that is the following. The Kabbalists and the Alter Rebbe and the Tanya teaches that every Jew possesses two souls. We always speak of the idea that a person has a body and a soul, but really, a Jew possesses two souls. What are the two souls? There's an animalistic soul, an animal soul, and there's a godly soul. The godly soul strives for something altogether different than what the bodily soul, the animal soul strives for. The animal soul is looking for self-preservation. It isn't necessarily evil, but it's always seeking to increase its level of pleasure in materialism. So it's looking for more money, it's looking for more pleasure in whatever it might be. Now that temptation, that pursuit of materialistic pleasure, in its own right, in other words, if it was just isolated unto itself, it wouldn't be an evil thing, because it's neutral, it's a neutral force, and it could be used for the positive. If a person has a very strong, lot of testosterone, yeah, he could use that for protecting a shul. He could use that for good purposes. He could harness all of that energy for a good reason. However, if one were to channel that into some type of base pleasure that isn't appropriate, so now you've taken something which has a neutral state of affairs, it's neutral, and you've given it a whole new characterization by allowing it to drive an action which is less than appropriate. Is that clear? Does that make sense? In other words, there's a force which is neutral. It's not evil.
Gasoline, right? Could be.
There you go. Gasoline is a great.
Pumped in an ambulance or pumped inside
a suicide bomber's vehicle.
Bomber.
There you go. So the gasoline is a neutral force, and the question is, how are you using it? So if we take the narrative in that direction, where a person used that neutral force within them for the negative, meaning to do things that are just selfish, self-preserving, increase their pleasure and their desire. Now, what happens at the end of the day? What happens after a while that a person engages in this day in, day out? What happens when a person is involved in this on a regular basis? They don't stop themselves. They just continue. What happens? They become so self-absorbed that anything they want, even if it's not permissible, even if it's a sin against humanity, they will get because they want it and they feel entitled to it. Because they have programmed themselves to pursue whatever they want. Therefore, whatever I want becomes whatever I need, and becomes, therefore, whatever I deserve to have, and don't you dare get in my way. That's the kind of the downward spiral of this process, of this, the nature of this animal here. What happens if before the person has devolved to such a state, they just engage in self-preservation, in permissible activities that are not necessarily prohibited? What happens? So they have the potential still of return. They could turn around and elevate all of that stuff that they engaged in, all of the food that they ate, all of the, whatever it might be, the materialism that they engaged in out of pure base desire. If they were to then move to a better place spiritually, they can actually elevate all of that divine energy that they vested within those actions. They can elevate it into a better and more divine and holier place. It could be they can relocate themselves spiritually, together with all of the energy that they vested within all of those activities. In text number 13a, by contrast, the evil impulse and attraction to permissible things, even when done solely to satisfy one's craving, is one of the Jewish demons. This is the term that's used in Kabbalah. It is, as it were, a Jewish evil impulse, for it can be reverted to holiness, as was explained above. And in 13b, since the food itself is permissible, therefore, though it was eaten to satisfy bodily desire, it can still be elevated to holiness when the person returns to the study of Torah and the service of God. The Yetzer Hara for forbidden matters, however, is intrinsically un-Jewish, meaning essentially foreign to the Jew's character. As explained elsewhere, one acquires this foreign Yetzer Hara by immersing himself in permitted pleasures. These so coarsen him that he begins to lust after prohibited matters as well. A desire totally unnatural for the Jew, emphasis added. Let me just explain, based on what I explained earlier, the introduction I gave earlier, let me explain to you what this text just told us. When a person engages in permissible pleasures, say for example, pizza, yeah? So there's one level of eating pizza, which is I'm hungry, I need to eat, I need energy, so I'll eat pizza. There's a whole nother level of eating pizza, which is I love pizza. So even though I don't need to eat pizza, I love pizza, so I'm going to have the whole pie. And then what happens as a result of this type of behavior? Because I love pizza and I therefore eat the whole pie, 1 pie and 2 pies and 3 pies, so automatically I'm programmed from now on that whatever I enjoy doing, I will have, even if it's not permissible. This is permissible. The pizza is permissible. Benji's kosher pizza. It's all great. Right? Go to Hechsher, RCBC. You can buy however many pies you want. You just don't eat as many pies as you want. What happens when we eat as many pies as we want? That kind of locks us in to a routine. I do whatever I want. Once we are taught, we teach ourselves, I do whatever I want, then I will do whatever I want, even when it comes to something that's not permissible, that's even a prohibition.
It's a different pathway. We actually take ourselves a completely separate neural pathway where it's even just a guide. I legit need it more than you do. So if there's 1 pie left, but you don't need it as bad as I do.
Because I've taught myself that that's what I need to do. But that's the pie. That's the permissible pie. But what happens if a person is...
I need my 3rd pie before you get your first one.
But it's all permissible.
I make more money than you do, doing a more important job. Therefore, I need this extra one just so I can do my job calmer. Yeah, you're hungry, but you'll figure it out. And I justify the unjustifiable. Okay, but it'll be a hard case, a hard sell the first time
to say that would be a transgression unless the guy's dying. Unless the guy's dying. All right? But let's take this a step further. There is no kosher pizzeria around. There's only a non-kosher pizzeria. And what are they serving on top of the pizza? Give me an example.
Meatloaf.
What is it? Pepperoni? What is it? Sausage. Okay. So in other words, that's the only ones around. So because I don't have the self-control to go buy myself a different supper, a different dinner, so I will then go and buy something which is not kosher. Why? Because I'm already in that mode.
I know it's Shabbos. I need a cigarette anyway.
There you go.
Get my head right.
That's right. Exactly.
I'll daven better.
Perfect example. It's Shabbos, but I'll still take the cigarette because
I'll pray better. Isn't that what God wants?
Even without the excuse. The excuse is already what comes later. You can justify it. You rationalize it.
I have a little nicotine in my blood.
There you go. You're gonna be a great guy once you have this cigarette. Okay.
I need it. And God understands.
Exactly. God understands. It's a very, very common, very typical expression we hear. God understands. Whatever the case is, without getting into how people rationalize things, the very fact that one has moved from the permissible to the transgression, to the prohibited, that's a transition that's made once a person has locked themselves into this routine of always feeding what they want. I have no discipline. It's always about just me serving myself. So that person very often will end up making these inadvertent errors. Oh, I didn't realize. Oh, it was that. Oh. Why? Because the person himself or herself is already in that state of mind. They're not necessarily doing it out of malice, but the fact that it happened tells us about their state of spirit, their spiritual state. It tells us about where they are in their subconscious. Like we talked about the Freudian slip before, right? Not sure if it's an exact parallel, but the idea is that once a person is in that mode, is in that orbit, so these inadvertent things begin to happen more often.
Or parapraxis, in the sense that I don't censor my speech because I am quite so smart and to the point, and people come from far and wide and pay me fees to speak, so I don't censor my speech. No filter. I wasn't meaning to hurt anyone's feelings. I'm sorry. But if you just let yourself go, you're going to step on
That's
something.
another great example. You're going to end up hurting somebody because you've talked yourself into thinking about yourself that you are this celebrated.
I didn't mean it because people told you, careful, you're going to say something that's going to hurt somebody, that's going to get you into trouble.
Okay. So all this comes back to the subject of mistakes. The Alter Rebbe tells us that inadvertent sins, meaning shogeg, are an outcrop of one's deeper spiritual state. Here in text number 14. Over here he talks about the discussion about the reparative nature of sacrifices. He says the following, in text number 14. This is not the case, though, with the sacrifices that are offered upon the altar. They atone only for inadvertent sins which come about because of the strengthening of the animal soul whose life force derives from the evil forces of Noga. Now, what those mean, the evil forces of Noga, for that we would need to study Tanya, and please don't take them at face value. They have all kinds of important implications and shouldn't just be understood in its most straightforward meaning. When we talk about forces of evil, we're talking about things that really require more explanation. But here's the point. The point is like this. We might think that our spiritual slip-ups really don't have much to do with us. They're not. It's almost like we were forced to do it. Just like we said with regard to those actions that we did out of compulsion, like we said that they're not attributed to us. We might think that the same also goes for the shogeg, for the inadvertent. However, this is not so. The Alter Rebbe tells us this is not so. The more a Jew attunes themselves, aligns themselves with God's will, the more sensitive they become to this. The more a person becomes sensitive to this. And if we become desensitized, that's when we end up making these inadvertent mistakes. It's like I'll tell you a little story. There was a great sage. His name was Rabbi Akiva Eger. You may have heard his name. Rabbi Akiva Eger lived about 200 years ago. Maybe a little more than that. 200 years approximately. He came to a city, and there was a woman who came to see him. He used to go around anytime he went to a city, so the entire town would flock to the place where he was staying, and they would wait in line to be able to have a word with him for just a moment, and he would guide people, he'd give them advice, he would provide his blessing, whatever. One woman waits online and tells him that she has 10 sons, 9 of whom were scholarly, were erudite, were involved and observant. Her 10th son, for whatever reason, can't understand it, can't figure it out. Just is not interested. Has no interest. Absolutely no interest in, he's very smart, he went through, but he really doesn't want to continue along any kind of religious path. He's choosing his own way. Okay. Rabbi Akiva Eger says to her, my understanding is that he probably ate something when he was young that wasn't kosher. She's baffled because she always cooked, she always baked, she was the one who provided all the food for everybody in the home. What is this that he's accusing her of? She wasn't kosher, she didn't keep a kosher home. Don't forget, in the old towns, I mean, this was like the shtetl, this was like everybody kept kosher. Especially a home like this with 9 scholarly children and very, very involved religiously. Well, she goes and she talks to her son. She asks him, what's he talking about? Well, did you ever eat outside the home? And the son thinks and thinks and thinks. He's a young boy. He's 12 years old, 13 or 15, whatever. Yeah, actually, you know what? Not long ago, there was a wedding that took place in town. Now, let me explain to you what kind of wedding this was. This was a second marriage of a guy who wasn't. I guess he had an unhappy first marriage. He decided that it's time to get remarried. So he divorced his wife and got remarried. The child was walking home from school, and he passes by the inn where they're celebrating this wedding, and they invite him in. Come inside. You'll be able to you'll partake. Now, who is this guy? They did some research. Who is this guy that got remarried? He actually divorced his wife, but not halachically. There was a problem with the get. There was a problem with the whole process of the divorce, which really kept the marriage, his original marriage, intact. And he was now going and marrying a second woman when he really shouldn't have. And many of the great sages at the time, the way the story goes, including the Alter Rebbe, the Baal HaTanya, wrote that whoever provides meat for this wedding, they are pronouncing it not kosher. That whatever meat this guy whatever caterer he's going to use, whatever butcher he's going to use to provide meat for his wedding, the meat is not going to be kosher. And as it turns out, this was the wedding that the child ate at, and it turns out that in fact there was a mistake that happened. The slaughterer made a mistake. He brought non-kosher meat. He didn't realize he brought the wrong one. This is the way the story goes. And so what was the root of this child's spiritual diversion from his heritage? It began with eating something that had an effect on his soul that wasn't appropriate. So what does this teach us? This teaches us that what we eat has an effect, like your point saying earlier. And the more we are sensitive to that part of us, the less inadvertent distractions we will have, the less inadvertent transgressions we'll have. The more we desensitize that, so things happen, as the expression goes, things happen. This idea of being sensitive is highlighted here in the following text, in text number 15. This is a letter that the Rebbe writes to somebody. He says, you wrote registering your surprise at the idea mentioned in the talk from Shabbos Mevorchim Elul that a person cannot inadvertently b'shogig jump into a fire, but did not elaborate why you found it so surprising. Perhaps your intention was that it is impossible to imagine someone standing on a tall roof and then jumping downward without realizing that he is jumping into a fire or a similar scenario. This, however, was not what I referred to, as this is not a true case of shogeg. My intention was that to abstain from sin, one doesn't need any understanding or comprehension. A Jew's natural intuitions are sufficient, such as an infant will not jump into a fire even before he has developed the capacity for that knowledge. As long as he feels the fire's heat from a distance, the discomfort this causes will prevent him from drawing nearer, not on account of his intellect, but because of his natural intuition. For the Jewish soul, the Torah is quite literally a source of life, and its prohibitions are hazardous. Thus, even without any deeper knowledge or conscious appreciation of Judaism, she is naturally drawn to do a mitzvah, and will likewise withdraw from sin. This is how things ought to be, and how they are in their natural, pristine, unsullied state. It is only a consequence of corporal indulgence in the pursuit of materialism that one slowly becomes desensitized to this natural subconscious, spiritual disposition. There's a story about one of the great Chassidic Rebbes who was studying the tractate in Talmud about Shabbos, which talks about what happens if you're traveling in the desert and you don't know what day of the week it is. You don't know if it's Shabbos. If you think it's Thursday, it's Friday, whatever. You don't know what day it's Shabbos. What day should you observe as Shabbos? So the Talmud tells us what you should do. You should count 7 days, the 7th day you observe a Shabbos. But this child, who later grew up to be the great Rebbe of Ruzhin, famous the grand rabbi of Ruzhin, he says, I don't understand. What do you mean you don't know when it's Shabbos? You just look up at the heavens, you see what it's Shabbos. Now this was a child who was very sensitized. As a child, he grew up being very sensitive, and therefore was very sensitized to his spiritual being and to the spirituality of the world. And to him, to this child, it was an obvious thing. What do you mean you don't know when it's Shabbos? Just look up the heavens, it's Shabbos. You see the whole world, it's Shabbos. It's like the world is screaming out, today is Shabbos. Now, obviously, this is not something that ordinary people can experience. But nonetheless, it gives us a little bit of a glimpse into what we have the potential to experience. And that is that we all have it within us to be more spiritually sensitized. And the more we do so, the more connected we are, the less we will have these inadvertent, not pitfalls, but mistakes happen as a result. Just like he explained earlier, that it's almost like a child won't go into a fire. Why does the child go into the fire? Why? Because he understands what fire is composed of and how it burns and how it destroys all, and reduces everything into. He doesn't understand any of that. He just knows that fire we don't go near. Wow, fire. The same thing is also a child is educated with that type of sensitivity. It's a natural thing. There's a great story, another great story. I'm sorry I'm taking your time. If it's too late for you, please don't feel that you are being disrespectful if you feel like you need to leave. But there's another great story that's told of a chassid. I don't know if you have it in your student books. It doesn't look like you do. But there was a great chassid. His name was Reb Shmuel Munkes. He was the student of the Baal HaTanya, the author of the Tanya, Reb Shneur Zalman of Liadi, the founder of Chabad. And he was a very wise, witty man. And would often pull pranks. We just finished Pesach, and at the last day of Pesach, we recite the Yizkor prayer. So one time, there was a band came into to the court of Reb Shneur Zalman, looking for the Rebbe. And the first man that he met, who looked like a Rebbe, a guy with a long white beard, was Reb Shmuel. And he says to him, my wife is right now in labor, and she's been in labor for the last 24 hours, and she's not able to give birth. The doctors are really losing hope. What should we do? So the Reb Shmuel tells him, recite Yizkor 7 times. Recite Yizkor 7 times. He recites Yizkor 7 times, he goes home and everything is okay, his wife gives birth. The husband comes back to thank the Alter Rebbe, and he asks to see the Rebbe, and he comes into the Alter Rebbe, and the Alter Rebbe has no idea what he's talking about. What are you coming to thank me for? So the Alter Rebbe inquired, he probed a little bit, what happened? He says, I met a guy, he looked like a Rebbe, and he said to me, recite the Yizkor 7 times. So Alter Rebbe, it was Reb Shmuel. He calls in Reb Shmuel and says, what's the story? What's the deal here? Why did you tell her to say Yizkor 7 times? So Reb Shmuel answers, because when we recite Yizkor, all the children leave the synagogue. Anybody with parents leaves the synagogue. So if the children leave the synagogue by saying Yizkor 1 time, for sure this one little baby will leave its mother's womb by saying Yizkor 7 times. So this was a prank, but obviously Reb Shmuel wasn't just an ordinary guy. He had some guts and some backing, some intestinal fortitude to support those assertions that he made, those positions that he took. So anyway, that's Reb Shmuel. So another story about Reb Shmuel is as follows. He once participated in a Hasidic gathering, and you can imagine, in Russia, all kinds of people participate. There were peasants there, there were sophisticated people there, and the guy who was hosting the Farbringen, the Hasidic gathering, brings in what looks like and what smells like a delicious piece of meat. A platter of meat. As soon as Reb Shmuel sees it, he takes it and he dumps it in the garbage. I forgot to tell you that when it came in, everybody was oohing and eyeing. Everybody wanted a piece of that meat. Anyway, they give it to him. What are you doing? So he says, I think that there's something is not so good about this. Something is wrong with this meat. Something is wrong with this meat. And in fact, in a moment or two, the guy who slaughtered it comes in and he's screaming. He says, oh my gosh, I think I gave you the wrong one. I think I slaughtered 2 animals. One of them was good, one of them was not good. I gave you the wrong one. I gave you the non-kosher one. So now they see that Reb Shmuel now has some kind of intuition here. So now they really give it to him. Because any chassid who shows off his intuition, his spiritual intuition, gets it. Because that's the opposite of modesty. That's what you're showing off. You're showing off you have some kind of super, abilities here. Anyway, Reb Shmuel said, I have no super intuition. I'll tell you what it is. It's very simple. When I saw how excited everybody was about this meat, I knew there must be something wrong with it. There must be something wrong. Something is not okay. And this, again, speaks to the same point, that when there's a spiritual sensitivity to something, inadvertent mistakes don't happen. We have a certain sense, this isn't really good. I don't know why, I just know it's not the right thing. And so the shogeg category is something we need to atone for. Why? Because we allowed ourselves to distance ourselves enough that we're desensitized. And that's the idea. In text number 16a, these things that a person does automatically, unaware, and inadvertently are a reflection of his nature, of what he's immersed in and what he enjoys. The deeds of a righteous person, someone who finds his enjoyment in godliness, are acts of goodness and holiness. However, if someone is able to fall into transgression, this indicates that he finds enjoyment in areas that are not positive, not good. And now taking this back full circle, what was the Arizal telling us when he says that somebody who's careful with chametz on Pesach won't end up sinning throughout the entire year? It doesn't mean you won't come to sin because you're not going to have choice. You have free choice. Everybody has free choice. What he means is that when somebody gets so involved in keeping Pesach, in being careful about Pesach, that involvement, that exertion that the person experiences, that puts them in a different place spiritually. And that sensitivity that gives them ensures that throughout the rest of the year, they're not going to end up sinning inadvertently. Because the inadvertent sins, again, are things that happen unknowingly. But from the unknowing, we could see really where the person is holding. I'll tell you another cute story, another interesting story about Pesach specifically, and this will close. There was the fifth Lubavitcher Rebbe, Reb Shalom Dov Ber, who passed away in 1920, opened a yeshiva in 1897. He opened a yeshiva called Tomchei Tmimim. This was the central Lubavitch yeshiva, became the central Lubavitch yeshiva. There was never, for the generations before, there was never a Hasidic yeshiva, there was never a Chabad yeshiva. Much more informal. Chassidus was taught much more informally. It wasn't like there was an academy that was Chabad. At that time already, it became obvious that there was a great need for it. Don't forget, communism was on the rise, and a lot of Jews were leaving the faith, and it was necessary to have a yeshiva that would preserve it. So Rabbi Shalom Dov Ber established this yeshiva called Yeshiva Tomchei Tmimim.
Where?
This was originally Lubavitch. Then, with the First World War, they had to relocate to Rostov, much deeper inland, and then from there it was disbanded ultimately by the communists because they were under just once communism rose, that was the end of any organized yeshiva. Everything went clandestinely. So there were perhaps at times tens or hundreds of yeshivas that were operating clandestinely, many of which were operated by the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe Shalom Dov Ber's son. Anyway, so a student comes to sign up. His name is Avram Plotkin, and the Rebbe Rashab, or the previous Rebbe, looks at him. The Rebbe Rashab, the Rebbe Shalom Dov Ber, looks at him, and this boy isn't for us. He's not for us. But he tries to get in, and ultimately they accept him. But they say the Rebbe Shalom Dov Ber tells his son, who later became the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, he tells him that when it comes to Pesach, give him all the work to do to prepare for Pesach. Let him be the one who really works hard to prepare for Pesach. After that was all done, after Pesach was done, this individual literally had a changed demeanor. Became a lot more refined. Became a lot more of a refined individual. And not just became a refined individual, he became one of the great students that the yeshiva ever produced. He's an author, a great Rav, a great Torah authority, and I don't remember when he passed away, but I have 2 of his volumes at home. A wonderful, brilliant scholar. He obviously always had a brilliant mind, but in terms of his character, he needed to experience this hard work in preparation for Pesach. I'm just mentioning this in connection with this idea that when we're careful about Pesach, this will help us, help sensitize us. It sensitizes us for the rest of the year. And that is the idea of our subconscious. We want to be aware of our subconscious. We want to be sensitive to it. And when we are sensitized, then a lot of other things fall into place. A lot of other things work out. Okay, thank you for joining us, everybody. We'll see you next week.